Congressman Jamie Raskin is Democrat of Maryland. He sits on the January 6th committee. He served as the lead impeachment manager in the second impeachment of Donald Trump. It's great to have you, Congressman. First, what do you think of that? This idea that there was a consensus, tenuous as it was, about the evil that was unleashed that day that has since been obscured, and the committee attempting to reclaim it?
Well, that was clearly an important part of our objective for last night. And for the hearings generally, there was a vast moral and political consensus that what he had done was abominable and unacceptable, intolerable. And we wanted to revive that sense that people had, because there's been so much propaganda, disinformation, and conspiracy theory since. It was important for the country to see McConnell, in his own words, saying last night that Donald Trump was singularly, ethically, practically responsible for everything that happened, which of course is true. If Donald Trump had decided not to lie about the election and to accept it, literally none of this would have happened. There was nobody else out there talking about getting together on January 6th and storming the Capitol and overturning the result and stopping the steal and so on. It all came from him.
The most harrowing moment last night, and it's going to stick with me for a long time, is a White House security official describing essentially kind of radio traffic among Secret Service folks, some of the Secret Service radio traffic we hear, you played, as they're kind of realizing that the mob has gotten closer to them and faster than they had realized, that they have a closing window to get the vice president and themselves to safety, and that things are very, very close to going catastrophically bad. What was your reaction when you first encountered that evidence?
Well, all of the members could relate to that, Chris, because, you know, as I record in the book I wrote about this, members were calling their husbands and wives and kids and parents to say goodbye. That was exactly what was going on the floor of the House. People didn't know. It was a desperate situation, and no one knew where this would go. The first thought a lot of people had was that somebody would show up with an AR-15, because we had all assumed if anybody ever tried to rush into the Capitol, that they would have been shot. But now suddenly you had hundreds and hundreds of people coming in, and you know, there had been fears and also reports that there were armed people out in the crowd. And so, you know, in the age of, well, since Columbine, I suppose, but with all of the mass shootings that take place and that we've lived through, people really thought that someone was going to show up with a weapon of that kind of destruction.
There are two individuals whose identities you've chosen to obscure. One was the whistleblower from Twitter, and the other was the White House official last night who was privy to these internal communications of the Secret Service. Why was that person's identity obscured?
Well, all of those arrangements were worked out with the individual witnesses. If they were, if they had specific fears of retaliation and what might take place to them, either professionally or physically, because of their testimony, and in both cases it was very well justified. And the testimony, we found it to be important in both cases, and you know, there will be a lot to pursue in both of those cases. The remarkable thing is that there are still witnesses coming forward, and we still continue to learn more about the plot, even as all of the essential elements of Trump's attempt to dismantle the results of the 2020 election and overturn the constitutional order are well known by now to everybody. So we have to both continue the investigation, but then also begin to wrap it up by figuring out, well, what are the legislative recommendations we can concur on that will allow us to fortify American democracy against coups, insurrections, and political violence going into the future.
To your point about learning new information, let's talk about the Secret Service, because that seems at the frontier of the investigation at this point. And I have to say, what we got last night, both the intensity of those Secret Service communications, the testimony of that White House individual, my first thought was, wow, we would learn a lot if we could read the text messages of the Secret Service security details of the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States. on that day, because what I think your committee, more than anyone who's ever looked into this, has demonstrated is that that was the sort of, that's where the auto coup, the sort of self coup by the president against constitutional governance, that's where the tip of the spear was the men with guns that protect him, that he wanted to take with him at the head of the mob, as the other men with guns who protect his vice president were fleeing the same mob. What are we going to learn from the Secret Service? Are they being cooperative? What is the status of that part of this investigation?
Well, I think that is the biggest remaining mystery. We don't know exactly what we're going to learn. We don't know what the political dynamics were within the Secret Service. We don't know how hundreds, perhaps thousands of texts disappeared for January 5 and January 6th. We don't know the full details of the pre-planned migration of the telephones. All of that remains to be seen, and the committee is determined to find it out. But you're absolutely right that in a situation of a coup or an insurrection or some forcible halt to the transfer of power, there would have to be a physical, if not a violent confrontation among people serving different leaders in that context. And so it raises profound questions about the chain of command, about who different forces need to be loyal to, and what happens when officers are given an order that is contrary to the Constitution and the rule of law. What do they do? And how do we make sure they do the right thing?
Final question for you, Steve Bannon, who defied the committee with his sort of characteristic two-shirted defiance, told you guys to go take a long walk off a short pier. When you subpoenaed him, he was referred for prosecution. He was indicted, prosecuted, and today convicted for both counts. What's the lesson here?
The lesson is, please tell your children out there in America, if you get a subpoena to go before Congress or you get a subpoena to go to the court, go. You have a legal responsibility to go. If you think you've got an executive privilege for somebody else to invoke, even if the president has rejected it, as Biden did in this case, and you think there's such thing as a former president's executive privilege, even though you weren't working for that former president at that time because you'd been fired 3 years before, even if you think you've got a great privilege, you must show up in court or before Congress, and you must invoke that privilege to specific questions. So you answer the questions where the privilege doesn't apply. You invoke the privilege where you think it does apply. That's what your responsibility is. But nobody has the right to blow it off and just make fun of Congress or make fun of the courts unless you want to face going to jail.
Yeah, in fact, I learned this from my wife, who's a constitutional scholar. I think you know that there actually is no podcaster privilege in the United States Constitution. That's also an important takeaway here. Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Well, there might be a former podcaster privilege.
Yes. Thank you very much for your time.